Hello, Steve here again with a few comments on politics. I circle back once in a while to this because I think it's valuable. Politics is a great discussion once in a while for entertainment is one of them, I guess. For those who are politically motivated or politically charged, as in, they like watching a sports game, they might also want to watch politics during elections because it's kind of like that. It's kind of like a game. But I think that it's important to recognize what's actually going on in politics. For slavery, overt slavery has been abolished, and that was part of politics when it was, because it was government rules and regulations is what supported the continuance of slavery. But of course, when slavery was gotten rid of, there was a great conundrum for the political classes. I mean, we could just tell people what to do because they were owned overtly, and they would do it. But now what do? You can't just tell people what to do. So a very skilled public relations program was developed and called the public school and patriotism and all that. I mean, versions of those things existed probably, but there wasn't as much need when you could just publicly execute people if they disobeyed. Whereas when that became, reprehensible in the minds of many, that couldn't go on anymore, so there had to be different ways of doing it. And call it what you want, brainwashing, indoctrination, all these sorts of things. And we arrive at where we are today. And I think I'll try to talk a little bit of this more another time, but I think there's a case to be made for cycles of life. That there's you look at a plant, for example, there's the creative part of it in the spring, it comes up, and then it kind of stabilizes at a certain height, and then eventually goes to seed and then passes away and then comes back again, right? It's a cycle. I think it's a cycle in societies as well. So there's the Renaissance periods, and then there's the stability periods, and then there's the socialism creeps in, which is the dying phase of that destroys the fabric of the society, just as the decaying of the plant destroys the fabric of its strength to stand up and so on falls down. So I think there's something to be said for that. And what we see now is there's a lot of talk of private sector versus public sector, And I think those are two sides of that, two parts of that cycle that are happening at the same time. Because I'm sure within a plant, even within ourselves, the moment we're born, we're actually, in a way, dying. We're in the process of dying, right? And it's just what's more and what's less. I mean, when we're really young, teenage years or whatever, there's more of the growth period, the constructive period, than there is of the dying within us. And when we're 90 years old, there's more of the dying than there is the growth, right? And right now, I'd say the pendulum of society in what we call the Western world, and a lot of the world, is on the dying side. It's a socialist side. Because you have more public sector than private sector, or a growing number in unbalance. And you see places like Greece that are completely dependent on basically welfare on a large scale, on a national scale. There's apparently 3 or 4 people on welfare or some sort of socialist assistance to every one who's actually contributing. Is completely unsustainable. That's the dying phase, right? But I like to talk about it. It's come up to me a couple of times across my mind that this idea of public sector versus private sector. To me, they're just terminologies, but some of these terminologies don't make any sense. They are contradictions of each other. For example, a private sector economy is an economy that produces, right? And economy, when we think of things like home economics, people used to take home economics when I was a kid. The girls used to, and sometimes boys would too. But it's about being able to maintain or create a household. It's not about destroying a household, right? And therefore, the the public sector is the destroying side because it doesn't produce anything, right? I mean, even if you say that stuff gets done, it's done at a net expense, right? Because it has to leech off of the producing side in order to fund. And even if it does, like I used to work at one time for a crown corporation, a ferry corporation, and it supposedly made money. But it makes money with the guns of the government, making sure nobody else could ever do that. Everyone, one of us, just try it going into, without getting all kinds of regulations and getting shut down basically because of the heavy burden of those relationships. That just wouldn't be possible. And of course, whenever they have a shortfall, there's a huge subsidy. There's a big shovel on the back of the ferry, right? Shovel it on, whereas private never get that. So I would say that a public sector job doesn't really exist. It exists in name, and it exists in, but it's not something that produces. It is the dying side, if you want to take the analogy of the plant. So it's just, I mean, in one way it's kind of relieving to realize that we go in cycles, and it's not to make light of it, because if we're aware of it, we see it. And I think that we, unlike the plant, which has its life cycle inherent, I think that we as human beings are intelligent enough to, if you will, manipulate our cycles and make them better, make them more constructive. And even if we do go down a regeneration or death cycle at some point in time, we can go down it with humility and with the bright eyes of, here's why we're doing it, or here's what we can take advantage of, here's how we can get a different opportunity at the bottom. But the way it has been for so long is basically a cycle of brutal wars killing off so many people until a bunch of ruling classes get killed off, and then there's relative freedom for a little bit because there's no tyranny, and because of the freedom there's all this production that takes place, because when there's freedom there's private, right? There's individuals making decisions for themselves and their families rather than master-slave dictates, and things take off. And as soon as things take off, parasites move in. You see, almost as soon as an animal falls dead on the ground, there's all of a sudden vultures and flies and everything buzzing around it. Well, that's what happens with prosperity and surplus, is people get complacent because they start getting fat, and they start having more than they need. And what happens is the parasites move in, the ruling classes, and they start building up all this public sector, which are just a bunch of Hoover vacuums, sucking whatever they can. And as long as it's prosperous, you don't really notice it because you have surplus. There's piles of grain here and there being taken and sacrificed and everything. And when people are making lots of money, they don't mind a little bit of tax. That little bit of tax turns in a little bit more. See, leech will suck as much as it can. It doesn't want to kill the host, but it'll suck as much as it can nevertheless, until it becomes, of course, completely corrupt. And there's such a large public sector that many generations don't remember. They get lost in the bubble of just leeching, and they think that's how things should be. That there's some sort of control hamster wheel control room somewhere where a bunch of Keynesian economics intellectuals are manipulating things, and money can just keep on coming, and food stamps can keep on coming, and welfare can keep on coming, and corporate welfare and banks can keep on getting bailed out ad nauseum. Oh no, it's just a death cycle. And when it all crumbles down, people will look around And in a very, very quick time, I would think, within several years, the parasite classes called the public sector will just all of a sudden, due to necessity — necessity is the mother of invention after all — just get jobs, real jobs for once. Don't have to call them public sector. There'll just be jobs. There'll be jobs that produce something, because in that scenario where there's free markets and less coercion, if a job doesn't produce, it doesn't exist, right? If there's not creating a value for somebody, then nobody reciprocates with value. So I think it behooves us to prepare ourselves, because we are in this final stage of this balloon of public sector, which is the bloom of imagine the plant that turns brown and begins to wilt and die, and the winter is coming. This is the phase we're in the Western empires, I think. And it doesn't have to be feared. It's just part of the cycle that we have gone through. Perhaps we've had to go through it. But I think when we wake up to it, we realize what it is, that it's a cycle that has happened over and over and over again. And when we take our rose-colored glasses off and realize that it's not if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen, because it's always happened. To say if it's going to happen is almost as crazy as saying, if tomorrow comes, I'll do this and that. Well, the only part of the if is if I'm not alive, or I'm dead or whatever. But based on the track record, tomorrows have always come. And based on the track record of rise and falls of renaissance, stability, overproduction, surplus, largesse, corruption, socialism, large public sector, death of that, and then a regeneration. That has gone on over and over and over again. And those who read a little bit of history, or remember a little bit of history, and even just examine things for what they are, will realize that. And it's an eye-opening thing. It helps us with our quality of life, because we have a better view of what's going on. Every time we can grapple with a little bit of understanding of ourselves and our interaction with the world, it almost has a calming effect, because we realize that when things are run based on some kind of a larger cosmic law, if you will, that we can mesh with it and take advantage of it in some ways that help us, even in our awareness, and put us at ease in a way, not having to fight against it so much. Just do our best. Do our best in the lot. Whatever phase we're in, just do our best. And at night, we'll be able to sleep better, I think. Be able to enjoy people better. Be less critical of people's opinions that are contrary to ours, because we can see that, like us, people are stuck in a matrix of believing that somehow this situation is unique. And it's not really. The details might be, but the bigger picture of where we are is not unique. It's happened over and over again. So I just thought I'd want to share my thoughts on public sector versus private sector, and the larger scheme of things as to the cycles that we seem to end up on, and whether we're aware of it or not. As I see it, it's happening. So prepare accordingly, as prepare everything accordingly, and enjoy the ride. Steve here again, great chatting. We'll talk again soon. Bye for now.